All right, we're going to get started here. So, hi everyone, welcome to today's discovery session. I'm Natalie Irwin, Director of Stakeholder Engagement here at Efficiency Canada. I'm happy to be back with all of you, and I'm sure this is going to be an interesting session today. For those that are new to joining us, we ask that you save your questions until the end during the general community discussion period. So this is about 20 minutes, and there's usually plenty of time to get to all of our questions after our guest speaker talks for approximately 20 minutes first. We have a pretty hard stop at about 12:45 Eastern time so that you're able to get back to your day as well. So this is just quick hits of energy efficiency and related topics. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Sean Kelly, Director of the Clean Energy Team at Clean Foundation, who joins us today from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, to discuss how to communicate climate change. It's important to note that this is not about climate change, but rather about how to best communicate about this critical issue to a range of audiences, including those of us in the energy efficiency sector. So before joining Clean, Sean actually worked for 2 decades in strategic communications and adult education on environment and international development issues. Welcome and thanks for joining us, Sean.
Oh, great. Great to be here. I really appreciate it. So I'll just begin. So thanks. Yeah, I'm with the Clean Foundation. We're a member of Efficiency Canada. We're a nonprofit. We are based in Dartmouth. I'm actually in Prospect, Nova Scotia right now, working from home. If any of you know Nova Scotia, if you leave Halifax and head towards Peggy's Cove, I'm about halfway in between. So Prospect looks like Peggy's Cove without all the tourists. So a nice place to be sequestered these days. So really, really great, to be here and to be with so many folks working for energy efficiency. A lot of this may be things you've heard before. Hopefully you'll learn a new few things. As we all know, according to the International Energy Efficiency or Energy Agency, energy efficiency needs to deliver about 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions we need to reach the goals of the Paris Accord on the climate. That means a 3% annual improvement in energy efficiency is the rate we need to meet to reach those goals. And as you all know, that's entirely achievable using the existing cost-effective technologies and measures we have. So that's the good news. The bad news is the world's not on track. Global energy efficiency progress has been slowing since 2015. And in 2018, it improved by only about 1.3%. So that's why we need really strong organizations like Efficiency Canada and the work of all the people on this call. So energy efficiency is obviously a key solution to climate change, which means we're all in the business of working on climate change and for many of us talking about climate change. But how do you do that most effectively? How do you talk about climate change, which is, to use a technical term, a wicked problem? How do you talk about that most effectively? That's what I wanted to briefly discuss today and look at some approaches to communications around climate. This might be a little bit out of the realm of efficiency work, but I hope it can be useful to your efforts. As I think most people know, all substantial change has to be preceded by some kind of mind shift. But we have to remember that information alone rarely achieves what we might call transformation. Just because people know what we know doesn't mean they'll believe what we believe. I've been working in the nonprofit sector for 30 years and things have changed and improved so much, but I know back in the 80s and even in the 90s, a lot of nonprofits, we just felt if people knew what we knew, they'd believe what we believe, if we just gave them the information. And that's not always the most effective way of getting change. We need to engage people emotionally as well as intellectually, and this can be, of course, very difficult. So we want to change attitudes and we want to spur action. So mere propaganda or mere information won't work. We have to have messages that are non-dogmatic, that are grounded in the realities of people's lives, and often reaches their emotions. So before I get into some specifics about climate change communications, I just want to get into a few observations about how humans often view issues. And some of this might be Captain Obvious stuff, but I'll say it anyway. So this comes from research done by many groups and some of my own background, and just I've collated here. A few important points. People are more likely to do things if they see other people doing them, even if it counters what they know is logically correct. That's why often people will vote against their own interests. We see that in a certain country below our border often these days. If they see what other people around them are doing, they will often follow that path. People are persuaded by other people whom they like or respect. So sometimes truth doesn't always match what someone who they respect or like are saying, but that is really important to understand. When it comes to problems, the bigger the numbers, often the less people can care. I worked in international development for a long time, and there's many studies where you'll have a group of people and you'll say, here's $1,000 or $100, and you can do a project to help 10 people, or you can help this one person. And quite often the majority will pick the project that helps one person, even though logically you'd think you'd want to help more people. People are hardwired to understand our world through emotions and stories, not just facts. There's considerable research that shows guilt or shame is not really a good long-term strategy to promote change. And I'm as guilty as the others. I both succumb to guilt, and I can easily use guilt as a tool, but it doesn't work that often in the long run. It's better to find common ground and start some type of conversation that can inspire change and highlight opportunity. We need to talk about the values that we share, connect the dots of those values to climate change and how that's affecting us, and then talk about positive solutions that make our lives better. And then finally, as I did mention earlier, trust in the information and its source is an important determinant of perception. And that's a challenge for our times. It's very easy to get information and opinion from like-minded people. It's often called confirmation bias. So who the messenger is really, really important, and establishing trust is critical. Perceptions must be resolved before audiences can deal with the facts. So from my work previously with the environmental groups in the 80s and 90s, where people would frame things as jobs versus the environment, it was really hard to break past that, because some people I would talk to just think for some reason that environmentalists want to put people out of work, which is not what we wanted. So I do want to add or offer a little caveat, and it's an important caveat about the current state of climate change discourse. I think we've entered a new stage of climate change discussions and activism that's characterized, at least in my opinion, by two important distinctions from the past. One, I think there is a bit more cross-generational conflict, but hopefully opportunity. And two, there's legitimate and growing fear at a very deep level. Fear of the future, fear of inaction, fear of the ticking clock. You know, report after report says we have a very limited amount of time, not that many years, to prevent the really horrible from becoming horribly real. So I don't know if we know fully what the role of climate change fear will be. Will it spur on action? Maybe it will promote deep systemic change. Maybe it could lead to some people feeling overwhelmed or just paralyzed. I also think there may be a marked difference between people with and without children. So that's to be seen. All right, so as we're about to prepare to talk to various audiences about climate change, you're going to want to know a bit more about those key audiences. You want to really have a good sense of what you want them to do. Now, before you get into your communications, your messaging, you want to think a little bit about the various barriers that would prevent an audience from taking action on climate change. And again, some of this is Captain Obvious stuff, but it's always good to keep in mind that some people, the challenges of taking action on climate change may be because they don't have good information. There may be active campaigns of misinformation, which is a reality that we face. There may be cost. A lot of people, myself included, would like to do more on my home, but there's a cost issue, or I don't have access to the capital to do it. Maybe where they're located. It may be perceived attitudes, accurate or not, about the issue. Other priorities, there's a lot of people just trying to cope, just trying to get through life. At Clean Foundation, we run a program that supports low-income Nova Scotian homeowners on energy efficiency. And we find, even though it's a free program, there may be a year lapse before they actually apply. They heard about the program, but they may not apply for a year because they're just trying to get through life and cope. Lifestyle, some people may have lifestyle that they don't want to impede it. Complexity paralysis, this is a real thing. Skepticism, trust issues, they don't trust media or the government. They may feel they have no power. They may like solutions, but they don't want windmills in their backyard. Scientific illiteracy. This is an interesting one I'm noticing more and more. Impatience for action. People that really get the issues may not be interested in incremental change. They want wholesale change, and they're not wrong, but that doesn't always happen overnight. I think a focus on climate change adaptation could affect the urgency of greenhouse gas mitigation for some. They may think the horse is already out of the barn, so let's just deal with adaptation. It could be that they won't see the impact of solutions till much later. And a big one, fear of job losses. So people are highly motivated to avoid threats. We've seen what people can do and have done in the face of COVID-19. So if people are motivated to avoid threats to their existence, why is it so hard to get people to act on climate change? So part of it is because acting on climate change is a trade-off between short-term and long-term benefits. And that can be the hardest trade-off for people to make. Ignoring climate change in the short term might have benefits, both to individuals and companies and governments. So in the short term, you don't have to change the way you live. You don't have to change the products you buy, the cars you have, your commuting. If you ignore your carbon footprint, even though logically you know you shouldn't, it has short-term benefits. Companies can keep manufacturing with low costs if they don't have to develop new processes to limit carbon emissions. Governments can maybe sometimes put off decisions that we know they should be making because governments exist in a 4-year election cycle, et cetera, et cetera. Many of the effects of climate change are distant from people, psychologically distant from them in time and space and social distance. And people conceptualize these things more abstractly than things that are psychologically close. We've seen this with COVID-19 when we ignored it until it was right in our country and right on our shores, right on our borders. Then more people took action. So weather disasters that are probably a reflection of climate change, they might happen farther away from where someone lives, although those things are starting to happen close to home as well. So if it's farther away, you're not forced to grapple with it as much. So abstract concepts don't always motivate people to act as forcefully as specific ones. So what I'd like to do now is offer some thoughts on key challenges that you may face when communicating about climate change. And then we'll get into some solutions. So what you're about to see comes from some of my own work, but it's also some training I've taken. I took some training from the Yale School of Public Health on how to communicate about climate change, and also with George Marshall, and many of you may know him. He's the founder of the Climate Outreach and Information Network, and he's also the author of a really great book here called Don't Even Think About It, How Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. An excellent, excellent read. So here's a top 10 list of some of the challenges I think we're all going to face in climate change. I'm just looking at the time, seeing how we're doing. All right. So as I mentioned, a large body of research-based evidence suggests that climate change struggles to overcome human psychological biases against threats that appear to be distant in time and place. and the effects of the solutions may not be seen until much later. So humans are well adapted to respond to immediate threats, but slow to accommodate moving change. And climate change is a process, not a singular event. It's not one virus, it's many. 2, people often form and reinforce opinions based not on science, but through social interaction with peers, through emotive stories, values, etc. And as I mentioned, we also live in an era with active misinformation on climate change and a lot of issues. Social media can be very good, but it can be very, very bad, as we know as well. 3, we interpret climate change through frames. In the communications world, we call frames a way of focusing our attention, but limiting our understanding. We see things in a frame and we don't always see meaning that lies outside of the frame. So that jobs versus the environment frame that some people would throw at environmentalists, that's a frame. And we have to be really careful about that. 4, harm from climate change engages our moral brain. And then when our moral brain is engaged, many people look for enemies. But, and I'm being a bit simplistic here, climate change often lacks clear opponents. We all contribute to this problem and we all stand to suffer the impacts. Now, of course, some contribute more than others, but it's not so cut and dry as some other issues. 5, the scope of the problem is complicated and overwhelming, and we have to deal with the what on earth can my small contribution really do to help response? That's the classic tragedy of the common situation. And I get that. I put in energy efficient light bulbs, but then you go to Times Square and just awash with lights. So what does my 10 light bulbs really do? 6, stats may be meaningless to many. So what does 1 gigawatt hour of power actually mean? I work in energy and sometimes I get lost in gigajoules and gigawatts and all these concepts. Also, we do have low levels of scientific literacy that can diminish understanding of the issues. 7, as I mentioned before, fear of loss is powerful. Loss of jobs, loss of lifestyle, convenience, money. 8, political systems are based on roughly 4-year election cycles, so short-term thinking dominates. And it's easy to blame politicians, but honestly, there's lots of cases where politicians did speak the truth and they would talk about the complexity and how we need to make short-term sacrifice for long-term gain, and quite often they're voted out. So 4-year or short-term thinking can be a problem. 9, for those already active on the issue, impatience for deeper action can be a barrier to support smaller incremental measures. And 10, a focus on adapting to climate change could affect the urgency for greenhouse gas mitigation. So we need to bring the future mentally closer, and we need people to begin to feel the specifics of a daily life that is disrupted by change in the global climate. This will help reduce that psychological distance. Only when people experience this future threat in the present, rather than something that's a generation away, will it have enough motivational force to get them to engage in actions that take more effort today. And this, of course, is easier said than done. So now I'd like to switch to a top 10 list of solutions that I think can help overcome some of these challenges in climate change communications. So I had a top 10 list, but now I'm going to go for a top 15 list. So more solutions than challenges. So some solutions to help. 1, with an issue as large and far-reaching as climate change, we should emphasize that change is happening in the here and now, and that we should, and importantly can, create concrete solutions. 2, we need to recognize those moments of proximity that we can take action on. The energy efficiency of our homes, the changing of our driving habits. We can carefully exploit bad news opportunities and weather events, and that can create moments of heightened awareness. Also, things such as protecting your property and the people you care about can be an important entry point for conversation. We should make solutions as easy as possible, not simplistic, but easy. Remove as many barriers as we can. And in a little bit, I do want to mention the need to always attach solutions to the problems. Otherwise, you get into what's often called fear management, where people, if they don't see any hope or solutions, they manage the fear through denial, through, oh, it's not that bad, through it won't happen to me or my community. 4, storytelling about the issue and solutions is important. Follow effective narrative rules with motives and causes, effects. Humans respond to good stories. That's always been and always will be. Create a narrative of positive change in which our action on climate change does not just protect what is already here, the status quo, but can also open up opportunity for a better society. Positive change in remote communities, green jobs for youth, cooler tech, a better quality of life, less commuting. We can use this to talk about not just the environment and climate change, but other positive things in their lives. 6, we have to resist the simple framing of the issue. Be wary of creating that false equivalency with the frame of those opposed to climate action. So, for example, I used to do a lot of meeting. You get asked questions like, this hasn't happened in a while, but if you work on climate change, you're putting people in coal mines or oil sands out of work. That's a very simple framing, and there's more nuance in there that you can offer. Now, at the same time, we do need to be aware of our own frames. I have them, you all have them, and we do have to listen to people who disagree with us and recognize that sometimes they can be a source of insight. 7, while there are stands on the issues that we must take, we have to be a little careful about that enemy narrative to make sure we don't fuel divisions or cut discussions short. And that's that is happening a lot in politics, certainly, of course, in the States when you watch the discourse happening there. So whenever possible, build a narrative of cooperation that can bring people together around a common cause. 8, relate solutions to climate change to sources of happiness, social connection, social identity, and family. Research confirms that people are less motivated by money than we think. Now, I want to be careful here. For a lot of people that are living on lower incomes, single parents, people in communities that have faced historic discrimination, money is very important. They're trying to survive. But for a lot of people, money is sometimes a proxy for something else. Money is shorthand for progress, for comfort, for security, for providing for your family. So that's a good insight to have. We need to build trust. We need to be honest about our own roles in climate change. Whenever I do workshops, I always admit that I drove there in a combustion car. We have to recognize that solutions aren't easy. We have to recognize people's feelings of anxiety about climate change, about jobs, about mortgage, about the fact they have to pay for their kids' education. The truth is that climate change is far more complicated than most other issues. 10, climate change does not belong to environmentalists. It involves critical environmental concerns, of course, but it's bigger than that. So we have to avoid language that stakes out climate change as the exclusive domain, this exclusive cultural domain of environmentalism. We have to understand people's values and then come up with ways that climate change action can speak to those values. We want to engage wider audiences, and that's really important. I don't come from a religious or faith-based background, but I know George Marshall talks a lot about working with faith groups and trying to connect climate change to issues of stewardship of the earth that some faith communities feel is a duty. So that's an interesting way into the issues. 11, when talking about climate change, we also need to talk about health, about cool technology, family comfort, quality of jobs. So energy efficiency at home doesn't just save money, it means healthier air quality, a cozier home, etc. 12, that drop in the bucket argument. I'll be honest, I find that a hard one to deal with outside of the usual cliches of it all adds up. You set an example for others. Those things are all true, but they can seem a little bit thin in a notion of problems. You can try to shrink the bucket. Your drops may have a bigger impact in a smaller bucket. So maybe if I was working here in Prospect, which is a community of about 200 homes, looking at our carbon footprint just of those 200 homes and the changes we can make may have a bigger impact. And when we open up to discussions, I would love to hear how people deal with that drop in the bucket argument, because I find it a real challenge. 13, we can remind people that we have solved or are on the way to solving big challenges. the hole in the ozone layer, for example. That has been healing itself and is on the way to healing. And that was quite a success. And we have to talk about the power of consumers. If everyone stopped buying product A, those companies will respond. 14, play on pride. Province X is a leader in X. Use strategic peer pressure, both neighbors, but also at a community level. And then 15, as I mentioned, who the communicator is can be as important as the message. For example, we need to recognize the hard work of people who are in so-called polluting industries if we're going to get them to consider a transition, and hopefully a fair transition, to a cleaner economy. We want to get non-traditional leaders on board. And people most affected by the issues can be really powerful messengers. As someone who worked in communications and PR, I would try as much as possible for me to not be the spokesperson. Because the people most closely affected by the issue are working on the solutions, they're just a far more powerful messenger than I would be. So we've been talking about how to frame climate change as happening in the here and now. We've also talked about how to frame the idea that climate change uncertainty can offer opportunities, jobs for youth, for small businesses, opportunities for First Nations. So when appropriate, we need to place negative info in a narrative arc that leads to positive resolution. So talk about solutions that are practical, viable, accessible, and attractive. I won't get too much into it because I'm aware of my time, but we also have to make climate change local. We don't live in abstract issues. We don't live in concepts. We live in communities. And belonging is a fundamental and universal human need. So we often choose to conform to our group. That's why our family, our friends have so much more influence on us often than experts. So whenever you're doing any sort of communications work, you want to know more about your audience. What are their values, their beliefs, their hopes, their challenges? What are the obstacles that they deal with? What makes them proud? These are the insights that will really help when you communicate with them. So that was a very, very brief introductory primer on communicating about climate change. Really appreciate your time. I wish you all the best in your efficiency and climate change work. So Natalie, yeah, if there's any discussions or questions, I'd be happy to deal with that. I'll leave this slide up. It's some really good websites that I use. And Natalie, I don't know if you share PowerPoints or anything like that.
We can share the PowerPoint, and we're also recording
okay.
us right now.
Sure.
So we will be sharing it, probably get it up next week on our YouTube channel. We've started sharing all past discovery sessions, so if anyone's interested and missed any, they can view them on our space there. So thanks so much, Sean. That was really very insightful. I know, or actually I didn't know, that that there's an impatience for action was actually a barrier to climate change, because it's someone that's so committed to, they don't want to do the small things. So I found that very insightful.
Yeah, that's been real learning for me, working with different generations as well. My son is Gen Z, and I work a lot with millennials often, and they're completely right. They really want more fulsome action right now, and they're right. But sometimes you have to take, this step. Okay, we moved the bar a little bit. Now we have to keep moving it. So it's been really interesting seeing that dynamic.
That's great. So I'm just a reminder, as we open the floor to questions now, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. Or at the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a Q&A box and you can type your question in there and I can narrate it for you. So we have our first question here actually from Jesse Hitchcock. Is, Sean, do you feel the same climate communication principles and tactics apply across target audiences and communicating with general public versus policymakers, for example? So are there other tactics that you think that we can or should employ in a policy setting?
Excellent question. I studied adult education, and the first rule of adult education is start where your learner is. So everyone has a slightly different starting point. For policymakers, there may be political elements. For politicians, there's the people that influence them and influence their voters. That will be really important. I think a lot of times for policymakers, you can just start at a higher level and you can be very frank about the challenges and how you have to tailor your messages. There's this growing movement called nudge marketing or behavioral insights marketing that a lot of governments and policymakers are looking at. So how can you do things to nudge people along certain paths? But it's a really good point. I think my presentation is definitely more on public audiences. At Clean, our work with policymakers is a little bit different, and it starts at a different playing field and recognizes even more complexity to their work.
Yeah, definitely. And I will, on that note, I will mention that we actually have a list. I believe Clean Foundation is part of that on our website. We've compiled all across Canada anyone that has a letter of support for energy efficiency, and not just us. We thought it was really important to show that there's quite a significant number of organizations that are supporting energy efficiency in Canada's economic recovery. You can find that on our website. So that's something that's really important as well. So if you are reaching out to policymakers, there's pre-written letters that all you have to do is enter your postal code and it automatically goes. You don't even have to know who your MLA or your MP is. It populates it for you, which is very handy.
And if I can quickly jump in, we have a blog series called cleanrecovery.ca, and on it is a bit of research from, or surveys from Narrative Research in the Maritimes showing absolutely overwhelming support in Atlantic Canada for greener recovery and using our money to have environmentally sound economic development. So those stats are really useful for us when we talk to politicians and policymakers, because it proves that this actually can be a winning issue.
Yeah, exactly. So I have a question here from Grace. She's going to ask it herself here.
Hey, Grace.
Hi, Sean. Can you hear me?
I can.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. I have a specific question about balancing asking people to do their part as like the everyday consumer, but not falling into the large corporate narrative that people and their purchasing habits are the main problem. How do you find that balance in communication?
Excellent question. I recently, this week, did a session similar like this with our Clean Leaders Youth Internships at Clean, and that question came up again and again, because you're right, there is a narrative. I'm sure it drives a lot of us crazy. If you just buy this product, you'll save the earth. Well, no, that's just BS. So yeah, that individual action versus the broader systemic change is a real challenge. This may not be an appropriate analogy, but I sometimes look at those individual things as almost gateway drugs into deeper environmental action. So I certainly don't dismiss them. But yeah, we have to be careful to never fall in that narrative. Oh, if we just recycle our bottles, everything's great. And I think politically and with our wallets, we do have to acknowledge that the reality is that individual actions or individual impacts are quite small compared to certain industries, certain large-scale systems. So again, it's a challenge. When I'm working with some audiences that just don't have that awareness at all, they only, like my neighbor who's a mechanic, I would work with them, or I would talk to them in a way where it's more focused on their own reality and then maybe expand it later. But with a lot of audiences, looking at purchasing power at companies, at government policies.
That's a really good question and a good point,
Yeah,
Sean.
really
I know you mentioned the IEA in your presentation that like 40% of meeting our Paris Accord greenhouse gas reductions is going to come from energy efficiency. And another stat that I found, and the reason I'm actually working at Efficiency Canada is actually from this stat, is that 70% of meeting those targets are going to come from policy changes. Done by the government. So we really have to, while it's important for us to change our light bulbs and to do things for our own home and businesses, it's really, we really need to push the government to make these changes mandatory. So I thought that was a really interesting
Yeah,
slash terrifying stat.
yeah, and I would say that something that we have to be really careful, and it's always happened to a lot of us, is these things we're talking about are not radical, but they've been portrayed as radical, and we just have to get rid of that frame or flip it. What's radical is wasting 60% of your energy. What's radical is an economic activity that is destroying the very thing that it's based on. So we do have to be really careful. The word radical, I believe, originally came from the phrase "get to the root of." So yes, in that case, things are radical, but the way the word's often used, these things shouldn't be radical.
Yeah, common sense. I would say energy efficiency literally makes sense.
Yeah.
Another question here from Angela is, how effective is the employment of moral arguments to inspire action on climate change? You touched on it a little bit, but she'd love if you could expand a little more. And then she goes into detail, especially in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. If you want to go there.
No, it's happy to go there. It's a really, really good question. Certainly at Clean Foundation, the last couple of years, we've added social equity, anti-racism work to our foundational goals, because you can't, in a way, have one without the other. It's really, really important. So I think that with many audiences, the moral argument is really, really important. We've seen a sea change. I hope I'm right when saying that something is fundamentally changing the last few months through Black Lives Matter and what we're seeing in this world. And a lot of people that I've never seen before just saying enough is enough, right is right, wrong is wrong. So I think that moral argument is really important. The truth and reconciliation process that Canada is going through, I think that engages morality quite strongly. Again, this book, it talks a lot about it and how in some communities, morals are really, really important, and it is a good starting point. With some people that are maybe struggling with guilt or struggling with, they're learning about white privilege or discrimination against Indigenous peoples, and they're struggling to deal with that. So that's a good thing, but we have to do it in a way, and I'm not an expert on this, but do it in a way to always advance the issues and their actions and their understanding without losing them in the cause, if you know what I mean. So at Clean, we have a bit of a mantra we've been using recently: take stock, but don't stop. We're all constantly taking stock of where we are and where we need to be better, but we're not going to be paralyzed, and we're just going to, the actions we're trying to take, keep taking them. And so that's a mantra I think we can use for a lot of these issues. That was a bit of a rambling answer, so I don't have a clear way of saying it, other than with some people, the morality, they do look for enemies, but if the quote unquote enemy is their lifestyle, they can then get into what's called fear management and taking cognitive shortcuts to get themselves out of the truth.
I really like that, the take stock but don't stop. You guys need to do a postcard of that and share it on your social media.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah,
like that.
We didn't want to, we need to do better. So many of us need to do better, but I didn't want us to just completely navel gaze. We're taking some actions. We need to take more. Take stop, but don't stop.
We can always improve. Continuous improvement, right? I'm just going to stop us there. I know there are a few questions, so I can have them direct to you, Sean, just because we're almost at the end of time and I have a few things I want to discuss. So just so people know that we are taking a break from the discovery sessions in August. However, very good news is that we've decided to mix things up on Fridays at noon. So we have something else planned, because with COVID-19 postponing or canceling a lot of conferences across the country for the foreseeable future, we felt there was a need for networking spaces just to maintain those important connections. So in August, we're going to be hosting 4 unprofessional networking events on Fridays at noon, just to get people in our sector meeting, talking, and having fun. So you can attend all 4 or choose and pick and choose which ones you want to attend. We have trivia, talent show, name that song, and just plain old networking and coffee breaks. So be sure to register for those on our website. So it won't be the regular Discovery link. And then we will start with the Discovery again in September. So just so you know, I hope you can join us for those. We have quite a lot of people already registered for those. So there's going to be a great turnout, which will be fun, which is the intent. And so for those of you that are going to join me next week, along with our guest speakers, we actually have Step Up, a new not-for-profit group who will be presenting on a topic I'm personally passionate about, which is how increased gender diversity can transform, innovate, and improve performance in the sector. So they were going to share some interesting facts. One they shared with me was, in Foreign Policy Analytics reported in March that companies with improved gender diversity on boards from 2013 to 2018 were 60% more likely than those without to reduce the intensity of energy consumption. So some fun and interesting facts that they're going to share with us next week. So Sean, I hope you'll join us as well, and I hope everyone on the call. And thanks for sharing that today. And again, I will email everyone that attended today the presentation, as well as links to the events that I mentioned. Perfect. All right. Thanks everyone. Enjoy your weekend. Thanks again, Sean.